Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. I love to try to mix things up, and I'm always thinking of new ideas as far as doing kind of specialty shows. And I just did a show yesterday, which was uploaded yesterday morning, I believe, on Lucio Fulci's Zombie. Just a horror masterpiece. One of the greatest zombie movies ever made. Probably the greatest zombie movie ever made. Uh, just, just a masterpiece. I've loved that movie since I was a kid, and I was luckily, or lucky enough to just recently find it. I went to Bull Moose on, I think it was Monday. Yeah, I went to Bull Moose, and I found it was the first movie I found, and then I saw. I was super excited, and it was a special collector's edition. Beautiful packaging, slip case. It was put out by Blue Underground. Blue Underground is just an amazing company. Blue Underground, of course, it was founded by Bill Lustwig, one of my favorite horror exploitation directors. He was the director of Maniac, which is my favorite slasher movie of all time. Maniac Cop. He turned that whole Maniac Cop into an amazing franchise. Just an amazing director. And so he kind of retired from the whole role as being a film director, but he started Blue Underground quite a few years ago. And basically, they just, re release all of these great exploitation movies and just amazing. I have quite a few of the Blue Underground series films, but I was super excited when I came across this and I watched it. It was my first time seeing it on Blu ray. I had only seen it, years when I was a kid. I used to see it a lot on VHS, and then seeing it on some like midnight shows on cable back in the day. I'd seen it once or twice on DVD. I've seen it many, many times. It was a couple of years ago. I think I rented it on DVD at Opera House Video. They have a pretty good copy of it. It's not the best quality because I don't know, it's kind of a crappy, you know, uh, or somewhat decent DVD copy of it. But so I was super excited to see it on Blu-ray, and plus the price was just amazing. And I did a show on Zombie, and then last night I started watching the special features, and there's about maybe about 2 hours, and it's so insightful and so awesome. A lot of the times for me when I'm buying movies, it's that can be like the deciding factor as to whether or not I will actually buy the movie. At the end of the day, I'm all about the special features on a movie because I love if it's a movie I love, or and I become so curious on how that film was created. And then behind the scenes, what the influences might have been for that film. So and especially if there's like really good kind of documentaries about the movie itself. A lot of the times, with special features, there's just your kind of generic behind the scenes thing, and there are these little shorts, and they're like 5 minutes, and they're okay, but they're usually pretty generic and not very good. And but as a collector and as a film fanatic, I love it when it's a in depth kind of interview, and it's and this one's pretty good. There's some really great and very interesting interviews with a lot of the actors, the producers who worked with Lucio Fulci for a long time, and that really had a big played big key roles in Zombie. So that spurred on the idea of why don't I do a show? I should do a show on Lucio Fulci, and I thought because I have a lot of videos and I do this a lot. I kind of lost track, and I was like, did I have I done it? Have I did I do a video on Lucio Fulci yet? I realized I didn't. So then that spurred on the idea to do this video. So Lucio Fulci for me is it, my love of his films and just him as a director and as an artist has definitely evolved over the last few years to where now I can easily call him my favorite horror director of all time. I'm just so enamored with his work and so in love with his work. A lot of his films I grew up watching. There were a handful of films in particular that I used to see a lot as a kid back in the VHS days when I first kind of got into horror. He was my first Italian director that I ever got exposed to. Movies like Zombie, The New York Ripper, and definitely the biggest one that I used to see a lot as a kid was uh, The House by the Cemetery. That movie really, really scared me when I was a kid. All of his films, when I did see them, The Gates of Hell is another one. When I did see those films at such a young age, I had been exposed by that point already to horror. I was into, a lot of John Carpenter movies, like most kids. Of course, way into, and I still am, but way into the Friday the 13th series. Those are like the first horror movies, more or less, that I got a chance to see. And then that, it led me to discover, eventually checking out, got way into the Hammer horror film series. Became a huge Christopher Lee fan. And then I got into I got exposed to a lot of the zombie movies, which led me to a lot of the Italian directors, and Lucio Fulci and Dario Gento and various other directors. But I was so young, I didn't really know that much about the directors. It was kind of, something I didn't really think about. But as I've gotten older, and now I've become like a pretty serious collector of these movies. It's reintroduced me to all of his films, especially Lucio Fulci. And I've been buying a lot of his films over the last year on Blu-ray and 4K, and it's just amazing. And I'm looking to always, there's so many movies to his credit, and so I'm always looking and on the prowl to, even up to try to complete my collection. And there's so many, and during this time with this whole journey I've been on, I've rediscovered, all of these classics that I grew up watching as a kid, and seeing them in 4K and Blu-ray where the quality is just pristine. But along the way, I've also discovered tons of other Italian and also European horror exploitation directors. So it's been amazing. And one of the biggest discoveries for me was Jess Franco, who is a Spanish exploitation director, and so who is probably overall like the most prolific director, and he's grown to become one of my favorite directors. So it's been an awesome journey, diving in, taking going down that rabbit hole in the world of exploitation, and in particular European cinema. It's it's going to be, it's been a phenomenal journey that way. Mostly in regards to the sense of discovery as being a fan, and talking about the master filmmaker Lucio Fulci, and trying to keep him as the focus and talk about his entire career is is in some ways kind of daunting because of how prolific he was. He was one of the most prolific directors. I mean, you're talking, multiple decades, from like, even going back to like, getting his start in the late 50s to like the 60s, 70s, 80s, he to the 90s, like just a career that spanned so long, and also, were he's primarily Lucio Fulci is primarily known as a horror director. Some people refer to him as a horror director, and they leave out or discount the well, actually, like he directed in many different genres. He started out his career in the '60s as a director. Working in the giallo world, and the giallo world is such an amazing style. And what's so interesting about it is it's a unique. It's so unique because it's a you know uniquely Italian. It's an Italian cultural style, and really the giallo thing. Like I think about what that style is or what it means to me, and really it's kind of the giallo style. The best way to kind of think about or describe it, I think, is like the Italians' answer to the English, Agatha Christie aesthetic, where where that, of course, the Agatha Christie style, is all about kind of the murder mystery genre, where there's a lot of suspense and things are kind of mysterious and ambiguous. And so the Italians had were very much influenced by that and created their own style of filmmaking, something that hadn't really been done so much before. I had never been done before, where they took those kind of characteristics of like the classic Agatha Christie murder mystery story, but then they also infused elements of where there was lots of violence and lots of sex and sleaze. So it kind of became its own style. Amazing. I'm a huge fan of the whole giallo style. And Lucio Fulci more or less started in that style, and he's also done many other genres. He also made movies about World War I, World War II, and then he really did quite a few spaghetti westerns. And spaghetti westerns is also a very unique thing because that's also exclusively like an Italian style, like giallo, where it's their rendition of like the American Western. Sergio Leone is probably the most well known and most well respected spaghetti Western director, from Italy. Amazing, amazing. And so, but he dove pretty deeply into that style for a long time. And then he eventually got into horror films. And it seems like from reading about him and following, his career, when he became a horror director, he really, was kind of at the height of the horror expectation world in late '60s, '70s, especially the '70s, where that whole genre really exploded, and there were, thousands and thousands of like-minded filmmakers putting out all of these kind of trashy horror exploitation movies. A lot of American directors and a lot of European and Italian directors. It was a massive scene during the time of the grindhouse cinema, and my favorite period. I look at that period. I think sometimes if I had a way of an access to a time travel machine, I would have, I would, my first place that I would go to would be to go to New York in like, the mid to late '70s, early '80s, and experience the whole like grindhouse way of life. Like, where, you would go to 42nd Street, as sleazy and as dangerous as it was, but just having access where you would pay, a super cheap ticket price, and you would go in and just see all of these sleazy low budget movies, virtually for free, compared to today's prices. But so many, such a great, such a wild time for cinema. That's like my favorite period. So, but his career, Lucio Fulci's career, seemed to really take off, especially during during those decades. You know, when he got into making horror films, and that's what he's kind of known for. But I think it's important to like realize that wow, he also you know wasn't as he's not. It's not as easy to classify him as a pure horror director. Because he did many other styles. And again, he was such an incredibly prolific director. And the last few years, I've been buying quite a few of his films on Blu-ray, and I've just been so blown away. Um, Demonia is one movie that I have, which came out in 1990. I didn't realize it was that late in his career. Amazing movie. I'm gonna eventually do a show on that movie. I haven't done anything about that or with that movie, um, but so good. Warriors of the Year 20. I did a review, yeah. Warriors of the Year 2072. I also left out that Lucio Fulci also did science fiction movies as well. So I mean, he was all over the place style wise. But Warriors of 2072 is such a killer movie. I did a review on that last year. I own that on Blu-ray. The New York Ripper, of course, just a masterpiece. Arguably, probably it's hard to say which is my favorite Lucio Fulci movie. My go-to movie that I watch that I've seen the most is The House by the Cemetery. I think that movie is just so goddamn awesome. Um, but The New York Ripper is right up there also. That movie is one of pound for pound is probably like the sleaziest, dirtiest, nastiest movie, the nastiest movie ever made. I mean, it's so brutal, and you know, you're kind of dumbfounded by some of what you're seeing on the screen because it's just so like rough and just so like brutal. But such an amazing movie. I have a really great edition of The New York Ripper that came out in 1982. Um, and of course, City of the Dead, or it's also known as The Gates of Hell. Masterpiece movie from 1980. Oh, just such a damn good movie. I have a really great edition of that also. Um, and another movie that is an example of his, amazing giallo period, The Lizard in a Woman's Skin from 1971. That movie is such a trip. It's such a. I feel like that movie is like watching it's like being in an acid trip. It's pure giallo. It's got elements of horror. It's pretty gory. It's pretty graphic, but it's super trippy, and it's got such an interesting kind of murder mystery scenario around it. Amazing, amazing. I have that on Blu-ray, and man, it's just so gorgeous and amazing. And of course, I have House by the Cemetery, which is arguably probably my favorite of his films. Just an amazing masterpiece, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, like horror movie ever made. Um, yeah, just so creepy, and again, it's so Lucio Fulci was known for the violence in his films, especially his horror films, that was just so over the top, and his reliance on purely practical effects. So like when it brings me back to like why do I love his film so much? It always brings me back to the period of like when I saw his stuff as a kid, and again like my first exposure to horror was like the Friday 13th franchise, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and well actually I it's funny that I brought that up. Growing up, my parents loved horror films. Well, my mom was a big horror fan. Uh, my dad not so much, but my mom was way into horror films, and she would let me watch all the Friday 13th movies, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and various other movies that were pretty big in the day, back in the day. And she would let me, when we would go to this video store as a kid, she would let me more or less rent anything I wanted. And but there were two movies that she would not let me watch because she felt that they were too real. And that was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, and then The Exorcist. Those two movies were basically banned, and I did not actually see those movies until I was in college. So, and then another big uh, group of movies that were part of my childhood when I first got into horror was the Hammer films, the classic Hammer films, centered around the character of Dracula, played by the iconic Christopher Lee. Like that was my youth as a kid. But it wasn't. I remember seeing when I first saw, and shortly after that discovery of all of those movies, I had seen the first Lucio Fulci movie I ever saw was The House by the Cemetery, and then I saw The Gates of Hell, and I think I did see the New York Ripper somehow at that time, which is crazy. Um, all in VHS, and his movies just had a different effect on me. When I think about why he's my favorite horror director, but what is it about his film and his filmmaking style? And I don't know, his films, those films that I mentioned, like they just got under my skin, in a deeper way. They were more disturbing in a lot of ways. They were more graphic, but they just pushed the envelope. But it was just that they were so raw and just so, you know, going for your jugular. They were, there's nothing polished about it, and I think it's just that rawness. And the other thing that is amazing about Lucio Fulci's films is the atmosphere. Like, filmmaking and being, well, I think creating a film, from a director's perspective, and then also from an audience perspective, you want to create. It's essentially like world building, and you want there to be 2 hours. You want the experience to be 2 hours of pure unadulterated escapism, where you're for those 2 hours. Ideally you're escaping the mundane and you're forgetting about your day, and you're in this alternate universe for those 2 hours. And essentially it's kind of like world building. And I think Lucio Fulci was a master of that because the atmosphere he created, just astounding, unlike anything else. And I also, I cover lots of different films and talk about a lot of different directors. And I always go back to the world of horror exploitation because that is my favorite style overall. But, I love films by Steven Spielberg. My favorite director of all time is Stanley Kubrick. I did a big show on him and a few of his films last year. And, it's interesting because I think of how different those styles are. And I often think of or use as an example, one of my favorite exploitation directors is Herschel Gordon Lewis. So many great classics, just pure trash cinema, and I think about what's different about, say, someone like Stanley Kubrick and, say, for example, Herschel Gordon Lewis, or even any of the other directors I just mentioned. Obviously, with today being about Lucio Fulci or like Jess Franco. Um, and I think it's this skill set involved. Like I think on paper, like Kubrick and or even Francis Ford Coppola, but I brought up Steven Spielberg. Like on paper, from a if you look at the style of how those guys created films and how they do create films, from a technical perspective, they had an incredible skill set. Very meticulous. They knew everything inside and outside of the camera, the cinematography, like the textbook analytics of how to make a film. And I feel, and then they also had the luxury of having a large studio backing them and also giving them lots of money, resources to create their vision. And I feel like the exploitation director, for instance, like Herschel Gordon Lewis, for me, those guys clearly don't have that skill set. They clearly don't have that level of tools in their toolbox to create those films. And definitely they did not have the luxury of having those huge budgets. And like I did a podcast recently last year on this guy Matthew Littlefield, who's a super cool guy. He's a fellow musician in the area, but he also has a podcast that's actually really cool. And he does some movie shows, and he had me on there talking about movies and the film Fanatic stuff I do. And we spent a lot of time talking about exploitation, and which was great. And he was asking me like, what is it about those films that you love? And I made the analogy, and I often think it's a pretty decent analogy of it, or good overview. Is to me, it's like with exploitation, it's like, you take a great like classic punk rock album and you put it in, and it's really the energy that just is captivating. It's not super clean. It's not technically the most proficient thing. It's not really. There's mistakes. There's not a lot of takes. There's not a lot of money thrown into the project. It's really raw and just kind of going for it. But it's about the emotion, and it's about the vibe. It's about the feel, and that's what I feel for me with that style of music is what resonates with me. And and for what it is, and it works in that context. And I think that's how exploitation is for me. It's that same kind of thing. It's like putting on a punk rock record. It's just raw. It's like a guerrilla style of creating art. You're just going for it. You don't have the luxury of doing 1,000 takes of a scene and having a big budget, but you're just, these filmmakers were filled with passion, and they just went for it, even though they had all of these technical limitations. So I always think that's probably the difference. That's the difference between someone like Jess Franco or Herschel Gordon Lewis as opposed to comparing them to say Kubrick or Spielberg. So, but I also feel that Lucio Fulci, I do think that he had the skill set that was equal to someone like Kubrick or Spielberg. I think he technically really was on the same level in a lot of ways. He kind of a rare. He was such a rare breed, and I feel like that's what elevates him a lot as this iconic director. Even though he made these really trashy, exploitative movies, I think he had that balance. But I think at the end of the day, he really did have this, impeccable skill set. So he's in a little bit of a different category, even though he's definitely like a horror, exploitation director. Because a lot of his films are super sleazy, ultra violent. He didn't have big budgets for a lot of his films. He was prolific, and he would just turn out movies, and he was filled with such passion. So, you know, so just a really unique and wondrous director. The other thing that's really interesting that I've, been coming across and reading about was Lucio Fulci, the man, and stories about how he was to his crew. And, he had, I think, or his crew, for most of his movies, he had a lot of the same people working. So he definitely had, the crew that he worked with and all those things. They had a sense of loyalty, and they did love him, and there was a mutual respect. And so he used a lot of the same Italians on most of his films. But when you listen to stories, and I've heard more and more stories about how he, treated people on set, he kind of comes across to a degree as like, you know, uh, kind of an kind of an awful person. In particular, well, when I was watching Zombie and I was watching his special features, there's a lot of great interviews, and they talked to some of the actors involved with it, and they said that mostly in regards to like women that were on set, like how he treated people and how he was pretty kind of a bastard. And some actors felt they got along with him really, really well. And he was definitely very, very eccentric, and he was super passionate and really stubborn. But he, knew what he wanted to get on captured on the big screen. But there, at least in this special features, and I've heard about it in the past, where, he really lambasted people on the set and was kind of a bastard. But even the worst case scenarios or the worst stories I've heard, which have been pretty bad, there seemed they seemed these actresses, particularly around women. One of the interesting things on Zombie was they interviewed one of the two of the male actors that were involved in that movie, and he talked about that how he treated women on the set and how he was just you know just just a bastard to them to a degree, and they felt that he did that because he had terrible luck with women, and he had this real dysfunctional relationship with women his entire life. So it would affect his professional life, which is kind of fucked up. But and I've heard stories about that before, and I've seen it in documentaries. But I have to say too that even in the worst kind of examples of how he probably treated a lot of these people, and particularly women, he these women, actresses that I've come across with through interviews, these female actresses all like also gave him a tremendous amount of respect, and they went on to work with him more. So very compli it's a very complicated kind of thing, but I think there was still a love and a sense of dedication and respect to a degree, even though he was kind of a volatile, person. But still, at the end of the day, those these are all examples. When I talk about his style and what I feel like makes his films so thrilling. Just all examples of why I feel he is, my favorite uh, horror director of all time. For a long time, he was just my, making your top picks are always a little bit silly, but for a long time, he was always my favorite Italian director. And when you say there's an ocean of amazing Italian directors, but he always came to the top for me. But over time, since I've acquired more of his movies, and I've explored more of his world. And I always go back to his movies. I've come to the realization that he is my favorite horror director of all time. Just amazing. So yeah, check out any of his films, especially I would say The House by the Cemetery or The New York Ripper. Those are just pure masterpieces. And then again, he was so prolific, so many movies. There's a lot of his films I haven't actually seen yet, but uh, amazing, amazing stuff. So yeah, check him out, please. The master. So this is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Peace.